In this video, we're going to be doing a DBsign installation on Linux. We're running a pretty stock installation of CentOS 7 here on this machine, as well as a handful of prerequisites that we're going to need for DBsign. We need to have a Java runtime environment available. Here we're running the OpenJDK 1.8, but we support Java 1.7 and above, and we've tested on various versions all the way up to the most recent, along with other vendors besides Oracle and OpenJDK. We also require a database, and for our purposes here, we're using MySQL 8, but we also have many customers on other database platforms like Oracle or Postgres or Microsoft SQL Server and DB2. The same kind of holds true for your application server. We're using Tomcat 7 here, and we have people running on many different versions of Tomcat and other application servers like WebLogic and WebSphere and Glassfish. So long as we have a J2EE compliant servlet container, we should be fine. I've also got the DBsign product files already downloaded here on this machine, along with the certificates that we're going to be using, and my DBsign license file that I got from DBsign support. So with all of these things in place and ready to go on the server, we're ready to go ahead and start our installation. The actual installation of DBsign is pretty straightforward. We're just going to be copying some files to wherever it is that we choose to install. And of course, you'll follow whatever your policies and procedures are as far as where it is that you install software in your environments. But for us, we're just going to install it in opt. And so we're going to make a directory where we can put it, opt, DBsign, and just for ease of use right now, we're just going to change the owner of that directory to this DBsign admin user that we're running. And I mentioned earlier that I already have the DBsign product files downloaded, and I downloaded the ISO image from the DBsign website and then just extracted it here. And if we go in and take a look inside of the installation media, we'll see several folders, and what we're particularly interested in is the things that are in the files directory. These are all the DBsign product files. So we want to go ahead and copy all of those over into that opt folder that we just created. So we'll get everything in files and copy it into opt DBsign. And they should be there. I also mentioned that I had some certificates that we're going to be using. And these are from our own internal PKI. We have several certificate files here and some P12 files that have the private keys inside of them, along with our root CA and any of our intermediate CAs. These are right now in my downloads folder for this particular user. So it's not really a central location, so they may be hard to get to for other people. So I'm going to make another directory in DBsign, just call it certs, just where I can put these things for now. And we'll just copy all of those things in there for now. And the only other thing we have is our license file. And again, it's here in my downloads file. I don't have to put it anywhere specific yet. I'll just make another directory in opt DBsign for configuration related kind of stuff, and I'll just copy that license file into there, just so I'm not relying on my downloads folder and my own personal directories to get to these folders. So let's just take a look in there and make sure that we have everything. Looks like all of the right files are there. We've got a certsdir, and we got some certificates in there that we're going to use, We've got that configure that I created. It's got my license file. So the DBsign files are all in place now, and we're ready to start running the DBsign tools and configuring our server. Now that we've got everything copied to the right places, we can start using the DBsign tools to configure everything and create our database tables and everything that we need to do to get ready to deploy our DBsign server. If you remember, we installed into Opt DBsign, and we have all of our tools here. And what we're going to be running right now are the DBsign admin tools. And they are a Java program whose main entry point is DBsign admin.jar. So we're going to run this with Java, java-jar, DBsign admin.jar, just like that. And we'll let those admin tools come up. So the first thing we need to do once we get into our admin tools is configure our connection to our database and configure our cryptographic mechanisms and where we find our certificates and things like that. So we're just going to open up. The first thing we really have to do is do our initial table creation, and this is just a list of all the different tools that are available to us. And we know we have to do this one. And anytime you open one of these tools for the first time, you'll get this login screen. And there's some default configurations in here. If you drop this little thing down, you'll see just a bunch of stuff. And right now, none of this pertains to anybody's environment. It's just examples. So we need to go in and configure all of that. So we're going to hit this ... button right here, and that's going to open up the config editor. And the config editor lets you configure everything about your DBsign admin tools, and we'll even use this same config file a little bit later when we get to deploying the server. And so there's lots of information in here, and there's lots of examples, and we don't need all these examples right here, but we put them in there so that maybe it'll be easier when you get to configuring things and you can see how some things are being set up. So there's database configurations where you're going to go through and configure your database users and where your database is and how to connect to it. There's a crypto section where you define how it is that DBsign is going to access your private keys for signing and that kind of thing. DBsign's crypto mechanism is modular, so that you can use different mechanisms to access your certificates and your keys. In our example here, we're going to be using just a P12, PKCS12 key file. Probably in your environments, like in a production environment, you're going to be using something else because you may have requirements that your cryptographic subsystems be FIPS 140-2 compliant, and key files are not. But we do support ones that are. For example, the FIPS compliant bouncy castle mechanism, cryptographic libraries have a key file that is FIPS compliant. NSS, we can use NSS, it's FIPS compliance. You can use on Windows, you can use the OS key stores that are built into Windows, and they're FIPS compliant. So there's a lot of different options here, but we're going to be using just a plain key file for now for our examples. And then down here we have our instances, and most installations are probably just going to have one instance, and it's going to be called default. You can have multiple instances. For example, if you're going to support different environments or different databases, or you have a centralized DBsign server that's servicing many different applications, then you can have several different instances, and you can have one DBsign server that kind of that works with them all. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through here and get rid of everything that doesn't have to do with MySQL in the key file that we're going to be using here. So we're just going to start at the bottom, and we're going to delete everything that we don't need. Delete. I'm even going to delete this default one, but I'm going to rename my example to default. And default is kind of a magic name for an instance, and we'll see that later when we get to integrating in with an application. When you call the DBsign server, you need to tell it which instance you're working with. And if you don't tell it, it's going to look for one called default. So most of the time, you're going to have a default instance. I'm going to delete all of these database cache configurations that don't have anything to do with MySQL. Now, if you're running Oracle, you do the same thing, except you're not going to get rid of the Oracle ones. Our crypto configs, I'm just going to kill the ones that aren't key file. Now, I just tried to delete one called JCE and it wouldn't let me. It says you can't delete this because it's being referenced in the following item. It's referenced in default. So let's see what that's all about. If we go down here to default and we look around, we look in cryptographic configurations. And it says when it's signing and when it's verifying, it's going to use this JCE configuration right here. So let's change that. We said we were going to use key file. So let's do that. Now we should be able to go back up and delete the JCE one, and we can. And we'll delete all that. We'll go through and we'll delete all of these example databases. And what you'll see, if we start clicking from the bottom down here, we'll see that various things in an instance point to things up here higher in this configuration tree. For example, the database configuration that this default instance uses is example MySQL right there. The database certificate and CRL caches are referenced here. So you have references to other parts of your configuration down lower. Now, I don't like these names. I don't like example, key file, example, MySQL. So I'm going to go and I'm going to rename this and rename it something that makes sense for me. I'm going to rename it MySQL and it's in my dev environment. And I'll do that for that. Rename, I'm just going to rename this one P12 because this is my P12 file I'm going to use. MySQL in my dev environment. MySQL dev. And what you'll notice is as we're renaming these, everything down below is dynamically renamed as it points to different configuration options up higher. So we need to go and tweak a few of these. Some of the defaults are okay, but for example, under my P12, we're going to actually need to point to the location of the P12 of the key file that we're going to use, and obviously that's not right. So if you remember a little bit earlier, we copied some of these files off into opt, DBsign, and certs. Now, I have several different key files here, and these are just various ones from our test PKI. I'm just going to use test Notary. We just named this one test Notary because it's the certificate that we use in these kind of installations to sign things on the server when there's not when it's not a user directly signing things. So for here, I'm going to use test Notary, and I'm going to make sure that I set my password. Now, these passwords are not stored in clear text on the file system. They're obfuscated and encrypted. And for the admin tools that we're running here, you don't necessarily have to put your password in these blanks. If it comes across an instance where it needs to access this key file and it needs the password, it will prompt you for one. The same thing will hold true up here when we start configuring our database user. You can type in your username and password in the admin tools if you want to, if you don't want to store them here. But when it comes time to configure our server, we do need to put the passwords here because your server is often running in a headless environment, and there's not an option to go and put in those passwords when you start up your server or while your server's running. So we're just going to supply them for now just to make everything easier. And now we're in the database configuration screen where we're going to tell it how to connect to our database. Now, I've already gone into MySQL and created myself a database user in a schema. And so I'm going to put all that information in here. And so I'm going to alter my connect URL here, and we're going to connect to the MySQL database on localhost. My username is DBsign. I'm going to set my password to the right password. And the schema name is correct. Now the driver jar path, this is the path on your local file system where the JDBC drivers reside for this particular type of database. Now, right now, this is a relative URL, and if you run the admin tools sitting in the admin tools directory, this relative URL will work. Sometimes you don't, and so I'm just going to put the full path to where these libraries are, which just happens to be right there. Opt, DBsign, admin tools, JDBC, MySQL. And that should be it for our config file. Now we will revisit this file later after we get everything in the admin tools done and we're going back through and we get ready to deploy our server. But we should be good for now. So we're going to close these tools and we're back to this database login screen. And now what you'll see is when we click here, we only have this one instance because we got rid of all the rest of them. So when we click OK, assuming we don't get any error information or anything, it means we've connected to our database properly. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our tables. Now, because we work with many different database platforms, if you're familiar with databases, you know that, Oracle has different data types than MySQL, which both have different data types from a SQL Server. And so we have to kind of know what our data types are going to be when we go to create these tables for different database platforms. And so we provide some metadata for various databases so that we can create our tables properly. And we're going to browse to wherever our admin tools are. Again, opt, DBsign, admin tools, and then under config. And we have several different files that contain metadata for our databases. And here we're going to pick MySQL. And the one you pick here will depend on what database you're connecting to. So we're just going to do MySQL. And then we're going to hit this populate button. And if everything's good and no errors, it means we've created our tables properly. And let's just go look in our database and make sure that they're all there. So let's go. We'll open up a terminal here for MySQL, and let's just log in as our DBsign user. And show tables. Whoops. We need to select our database. And show tables. And now we see we have several DBsign tables created. So now that we've got our tables created, we've got our admin tools configured, we can go from here and start setting up the different aspects of our DBsign server. Now that we've got our tools configured and we've got our initial database tables created, we need to start talking about what certificates we're going to trust and building our trust chains and setting our trusted certificates list. And so let's back up and just talk about that for just a minute. If you remember, we had all of these different certificates from the DBsign test PKI that we have available to us here. And we were using this Notary P12 file that we said we're going to be using to sign with. And you'll notice a couple of different types of files in this folders. There's .cer files and there's .p12 files. So the CER files by themselves are a certificate, and inside the certificate is the public key. And the public key is, as the name implies, it's public information that is to be disseminated so that you can verify signatures made with a user's private key. Now, inside these P12s are the certificate with the public key, but also the private key. And that's what we're using on the server to sign things with. And so when you go to verify a user's certificate, what you want to do is you want to be able to prove that that certificate was issued to a person by somebody that you trust, by some trusted authority. And so we have this concept of CA certificates, certificate authorities that you trust to do their due diligence to issue certificates to be able to prove that a user is who they say they are. And uh, some PKIs are different than others. You may have a root certificate, which is at the very top of the totem pole, and various levels of intermediate CA certificates. Maybe for different departments in your organization or for different purposes, like some may be for making digital signatures and some may be for encrypting emails. And so each of these intermediate CAs then issue end user certificates like our test notary.p12. In the DBsign test PKI, we have 3 levels of certificates. We have a root CA that issues an intermediate CA who then issues end user certificates. And so what we're about to configure our instance of DBsign here to do is to explicitly trust the DBsign test root CA, but we also need to make the intermediate test CA1 available in our certificate caches when it needs to be able to build a path, because you'll have an end user certificate and it will need to hop all the way up that chain to get to a root that we explicitly trust. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and define any of our intermediate certificates that we may need to have available to us. And to do that, we'll go into the Tools menu and we're going to open up this Certificate in CRL browser. And we're going to choose our database session. And here, see, we don't see anything in here yet. We don't have any certificates in our database. So we're going to go and we're going to find our intermediate CAs. And we're going to add the DBsign test CA1. That's the only one we're going to add in here for now. Depending on your environment, you may just have one or you may have dozens. For example, if you're setting this DBsign server up to support an application in the federal government or like in the Department of Defense, for example, you may have dozens of intermediate CAs that you need to add into here. But we only have one, so we're kind of done there. And again, those were certificates that we just need to stick in our database because we may need them to build cert chains. But what we're going to do next is we're going to build our explicit list of trusted root certificates. So we're going to open up the Trusted Certs Manager. And it looks like this. And we're going to go and we're going to find the certificates that we explicitly trust. Right now we only have one, the DBsign test root CA. When I add it in here, it's going to say, are you sure you want to add this certificate? Because this is a big deal, right? This is a certificate that you're saying you explicitly trust. And so best practices are you're going to get this certificate from a trusted entity. You're not going to just download it from somebody's website on the internet. You're going to get it from a trusted source, and you're going to verify the information. You're going to verify this fingerprint right here. So, for example, I know that this certificate came from DBsign support, and they gave me the fingerprint, and I can match it up, and it all looks good, and I know with all reasonable certainty that this is the certificate I want in my trusted certs list. And so I say yes. And then a descriptive field. Usually you can just take the default and it's fine. And so it's listed here. Again, depending on your organization and the PKIs that you need to trust, you may have more entries in here. You may have a couple of entries. You may have 20 entries. It just depends on where you are and what it is that you want to do. We're going to save this list, and the first thing you'll notice is it says you've changed your trusted certificate list and you need to sign it. We're going to go ahead and say OK, and it's going to sign it with the certificate we set up earlier. And operation complete, no errors. Now, the reason this list is signed is to keep it secure. For example, you don't want some rogue actor coming in and modifying the certificates in your database and changing a root certificate to reflect some hacker's certificate or to remove trusted certificates or things like that. So this list is signed such that if it's changed in any way without going through explicitly through these admin tools and re-signing them, then the DBsign server itself and these admin tools will stop working because your trusted certificates list has been modified. It has been changed. If that's the case, you go investigate it, see where it's changed, and take the necessary actions. So what we've just done is we've made sure that we've trusted the right root certificates and we've signed that list to keep it secure. And then we also added in our certificate database any of the intermediate CAs that we may run across that we will need to build a chain of trust from our end user certificates up to something in this root certificate list. Now that we have created our database tables and defined our trust lists, we need to go and we need to sign the DBsign system templates. Now, unless you're familiar with DBsign and the way that it works, that statement probably made no sense at all to you. And what templates are exactly is a little beyond the scope of this video, but it's enough for now to say that in the DBsign world, a template is a definition of where to find data in your database, what column, table, and the certain things are in, which columns you want to go sign, what the primary keys for different columns are. This is how DBsign keeps track of its own internal data, and you can use it. You can use the template feature in your application to sign the data that's in your database. But for now, basically what you need to know is DBsign has its own data stored in the database, configuration data, things like your trusted certs list and the list of users and certificates and things like that. And all of that information is digitally signed in the same way that the trusted certs list is signed to protect it from being modified without you knowing about it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to open the template designer, and we're just going to tell you, you'll see templates that already exist that are prefixed with DBS underscore, and we're going to use this far right icon right here just to sign all of those templates. Now, in a later video, we'll come back and we'll explain the template feature in more detail and how you can use templates to digitally sign data in your database tables for your application. The last thing that we need to do here in the admin tools before we get ready to go and configure and deploy our server is set up the Notary user that will be signing, that your server will be using to actually sign data. So we're going to go in and we're going to open up the user manager. And if we do a query here, we'll see that there's no users in a stock install. It's just empty. So we're going to go down here and we're going to add one. Typically, the only thing you're going to use this user feature for is to set up the Notary user. It maps a username to a certificate is what this feature basically does. And this is going to tell the server what certificate it needs to use when it goes to sign data. And so we're going to fill out all this information for a user. The first name and last name are basically descriptive fields. You can call them whatever you want to call them. But the username right here is very important. I'm going to do all lowercase Notary. This username is very important because in a default configuration of DBsign in the server's configuration file, it asks for the user that's going to be Notary signing, and by default, it looks for Notary, all lowercase. So to keep things simple, we're going to go with that, and we're going to keep it at Notary. And we'll go down here and click Next. And now we're going to tell it what certificate is associated with the notary signer. Now, if you remember before we were using this P12 file, it has the certificate and the private key bundled into it. But for this purpose, we just want to tell it to use the CER file, the certificate file, because this is just a definition telling it which certificate belongs to this notary user. So we'll just choose the CER. And security level, don't worry about what that means right at this point. I just always go and set it at 10. Is notary, this is a special flag for DBsign users that say whether or not it can be used for notary signing, server-side signing. And the description field, again, it's just descriptive, whatever you want to put here. And we'll click OK. We should see everything in here and finish. And we'll see it show up in the user list now. And very important, we want to go down here and we want to click this sign button. Because again, user information is digitally signed to help secure it from unwanted modifications, just like our system templates, just like our trusted search list. And so now we've got everything done in our admin tools. We've got our trust defined, we've got our database connections and crypto module configurations all set. We've got our templates signed and we've got our user created. And now we're ready to go and talk about deploying our server in Tomcat. Now that we've got everything completed in our admin tools, we need to start thinking about our server deployment and configuration. And before we actually deploy our WAR file into Tomcat, we're going to go and modify our existing config file so that to take into account some things that we need to understand about the server. So if you remember, here in our installation directory, we were in the admin tools folder where all of our admin tools were. We're going to run a new tool, and it'll look familiar to you. You've seen it before, called the config editor. And it's actually the same tool that we opened up when we were in the admin tools configuring everything, but this is just a standalone version so that you don't have to open up the admin tools. And we're going to go find our config file that we were working with in the admin tools. Now, when you run the admin tools, by default, it keeps its configuration file inside of a hidden directory. Here on Linux, it's in different places on Windows or on Mac OS, depending on where you are. But here on Linux, we're in a .dbsign folder in your home folder. So you see that right there, home and my username and .dbsign. So we're going to go in under admin tools and dbsign.cfg. And we're going to go ahead and open that up. And now you'll notice things start to look familiar. All of the things that we set up before. Now, when we set this up the first time, we were only concerned with the admin tools, and I mentioned that we'd come back and look at things for the server. And one thing to understand, the DBsign server itself is like a web service out there, and it has different types of requests that you can make to the server to perform different operations. By default, for security measure, all requests to the DBsign server are disabled, and we only want to open up the ones that you're going to need for your own purposes. And there's a couple of different types of requests. There are global requests that deal with the DBsign server as a whole. And then there are instance requests that deal with a specific DBsign instance on your DBsign server. And so first we're going to look at, under the global setting, we're going to look at our global request securities. And we'll see the different types of global requests here. And for our purposes right now, the only one I'm even going to worry with is show stats. And we can talk about the rest of these later. But show stats is good for testing and good for monitoring. It's just a page that shows statistics and metrics and information about your DBsign server. And so right now you see all of these are disabled. So we're going to drop the show stats option down, and we're going to see some different options here: disabled, privileged, and public. A public request means that this request would be available to anyone, that any origin making the request could make this, and it would process the request and come back. Privileged means that we're going to do a little more filtering on it by IP address, and we have this allow privileged from up here, and right now it's set to the loopback adapter, and that's fine, and that's what we're going to set it at for our purposes. I'm also going to put this is a comma separated list. I'm going to put something else in here. I'm going to put the IPv6 loopback address just in case here locally this machine's using IPv6. I've run into that in testing and development sometimes. But also you could do things like, let's say that your own internal subnet was 192.168.1 dot something. Let's say you wanted everybody in your subnet to be able to do privilege requests. You could do something like that. And that star is a wildcard, and it'll match anything that matches that pattern. But for now, we're just going to keep this on the localhost adapter, and show stats is going to be privileged, and all the rest are going to be disabled. So let's go down here now to our instance, and we'll scroll down a little ways to request security. And you'll notice the same thing, allow privileged from. Now this one is blank. Let's just set it the same way we set the one up in global. So we've got it set, and now we have even more types of requests, and they're all set to disabled. So for now, just for testing purposes, I want to be able to send a request to the server that'll make it sign something, and that'll exercise kind of all the moving parts down inside the DBsign server. And one request that we can use to do that is the app server sign request. We're just going to make it privileged so that it can only come from one of those addresses right there. And again, that request just allows me to ask the DBsign server to sign something. In our case, we're going to just be signing a little string, just some little string of data. And we're going to leave all the rest disabled. And in a future video, when we come back and we start talking about the different ways that we can sign and the different things that DBsign can do and start integrating into a test application, then we'll go through and we'll talk about each of these requests and which ones should be enabled and whether they should be privileged or public and how to lock it down. So now let's just go ahead and save that config file and exit out of the config editor. So now we're ready to actually deploy the DBsign servlet into our web application server and drop all the right config files and license files in place, and then you'll have a working DBsign server that's ready to go and start processing your requests for signing data. As we mentioned at the beginning of this video, we're deploying on Tomcat 7 here on this CentOS machine. And the default Tomcat installation on this machine is in user share Tomcat. Again, you may be using Tomcat, you may be using something else. So the steps here are not going to be exact for your application. But you're just going to be deploying a WAR file in a way that's suitable for your environment and your application server. In Tomcat, they're going to make it easy. But first, I'm going to make sure that Tomcat is actually running. And it is. It's active and it's running. Now, Tomcat, by default, is set up to automatically deploy WAR files that are dropped into its web apps folder. So we're going to go in here to web apps, and we're going to copy from opt DBsign HTML server dbsign.war. We're going to copy it right in here to the web apps folder. But I forgot to do a couple of different things. And Tomcat watches this directory, and after a few seconds, it will deploy DBsign into the web apps folder. So DBsign is there and ready to go. And we'll go in here and look in the deployment directory, and if you're familiar with WAR files, the insides here should look pretty familiar. We're going to go into web-inf or web-inf, and we're going to take a look and see what's in here. We have some config files, which are stock config files. And for the most part, we don't need to modify any of this right now, but the one specifically we want to modify is this DBsign.cfg. Now, in previous steps when we were in the config editor, we were actually modifying one of these files. And so we've got one ready. We've got one that's configured and ready to go. So we're going to just copy that one that we've already modified into this directory. And if you remember, in our home directory under .dbsign, admin tools, DBsign, .cfg, we're going to just copy that into here. And we should see our new file here, the modified one. Now, also, we want to copy our license file into this folder. And if you remember, we put that into opt, DBsign, config. Now, you may have your license file somewhere else. That's where we put it at the beginning of the installation here. Don't have permission. We see our license file here. Just to make it match everything else, I'm going to change the ownership to Tomcat. Now, everybody has a different license ID. Here you see it's F4, blah, blah, blah. The DBsign server will look for its license file in one of two ways. One, you can specify the full path to it in your DBsign config file. That's not the way it's done by default. By default, it looks for that license file in WebInf as license.lic. So we're just going to rename that file so that we don't have to change our configuration anymore. And everything looks good in here. So now let's restart Tomcat. Whoops, system, CTL. And Tomcat's restarted and DBsign is deployed and should be up and running, and it's ready for us to test. Now we should have everything installed, configured, and deployed properly. So now all that's left to do is just to test and make sure that everything is running properly. Again, DBsign is like a web service, so we're just going to open up our browser and we're going to throw some requests at it just to make sure that everything comes back right and everything looks okay. And the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to hit the DBsign landing page, DBsign, and depending on your application server and how it deploys things, your URL may be different, your port number may be different. So that URL may be a little different in your environment. So you open up this page and what you should see is your license information. And so it's all good. Here's my license information here. I have a trial license and I've got about a little less than a year left on it. And so let's try these other two requests that we talked about earlier. The first one was a global request called show stats. So at the end of server, I'm going to put a question mark and show stats. And this is going to bring up a page that doesn't have a whole lot on it right now because we haven't done any requests, but it will show the types of requests that have been made against the server and database connections and all that kind of stuff. Server information, memory information, timing metrics, all kinds of stuff. Very good for monitoring and troubleshooting your DBsign installation. Like I said, not much here right now because it hasn't handled much load. Let's go into another tab and let's do the other type of request. Remember, we had a request called app server sign where we're just going to tell the server to go and sign something. So we're going to say content type equals the type of request, and we got to give it some parameters. The only parameter we need to give this one right now is DBS underscore DTBS. That stands for data to be signed. And let's just sign the word foo. The first request sometimes can take a little longer than maybe what you'd like for it to take, but it's got to go through some initialization. But when it does come back, you're going to get a form URL encoded string with the results of the operation. And it's a little hard to read, but what we can do is look in here and find DBS error value equals 0. That means this operation was successful. If we look a little bit more, we'll actually see the signature that was generated. And this big base 64 encoded string is the actual PKCS7 CMS data message that was produced by the signature operation, the actual signature. So everything's working just fine. We're signing stuff on the server. Let's force a failure just so you can kind of see what a failure might look like. So let's mess up our parameter there. Now it doesn't have all the information it needs to sign, and it should tell us that. Yeah, it tells us that a required parameter, something that we needed to give the server, is not there, and we get back an error code and some error messages. Now, if we go back to our show stats page and refresh it, we can actually see some of these requests. We've had one successful app server sign. We've had one failed one. Now we've got database connections. We've got certificates up in memory. We've got total request process is 6. So we've got more information in here now. And this information will build and build and build as your server sits there and is alive and is taking requests. So that's pretty much it for this video. We've got a DBsign server up and running, and it's ready to start taking requests. And in future videos, we'll start talking about the types of data that you might be wanting to sign, the mechanisms that you're going to use to sign them, and how to integrate into an application. So come back, stay tuned for those future videos. And if you have any questions, just let us know.